Let's get Ben in here to talk about sea bass and seabream. Ben, you there?
I am here.
All right, let's go.
So, Undercurrent launched its U.S. wholesale Mediterranean sea bass and seabream price assessment back in May. That was right after the President Trump Liberation Day tariff announcement. And as a result, we've been able to really capture how the U.S. market has responded to those tariffs in the months since. And in a word, the market has seen higher prices. We'll get to that first. We'll get to that later. But first, I'd like to take a look at some of the countries of origin that we are tracking here in our assessment. So if you look at the Undercurrent Trade portal, you'll be able to see the U.S.'s largest trading partners for fresh sea bass and seabream. The top 5 individual countries are up here. You'll find Turkey, Greece, Spain, Japan, and the Netherlands. And our price assessment focuses on Turkish and Greek origin, as those two countries make up about 3/4 of U.S. imports of fresh sea bass and seabream. In terms of value, we'll switch over to that chart so you can see how much the U.S. is bringing in. And as far as values goes, the U.S. imported close to $200 million worth of fresh sea bass and seabream last year in 2024. Now, we just heard about shrimp and salmon, and compared to those markets, that's not the most earth-shattering amount, but it's certainly a fast-growing market in the U.S. With the exception of 2020, the pandemic year, import values and volumes have grown for each of the last 10 years. As we talked about earlier, data for 2025 just goes up to July, but figures are on pace to exceed numbers from last year in 2024. When we discuss tariffs on these two origins, we have currently the same rate of 15%. But these rates have been shifting. They weren't always sitting at the same number. For example, back in April on Trump's so-called Liberation Day, the president announced that the EU would face a 20% tariff, while Turkey would be subject to the 10% global rate. Then the EU was threatened with a 30% tariff, which led to all sorts of discussions about how this would be advantageous for Turkish fish and farmers. But again, the rates now for the EU bloc and Turkey have evened out at 15% when the tariffs came into effect on August 7th. And we're talking about the rates. Sources tell us that in many cases, the portion of the tariff is being eaten by the EU or the Turkish side of the market, and that 15% rate isn't entirely reflected in U.S. wholesale prices. Here are our most recent U.S. wholesale prices, our price assessment, which has been flat for bass and bream for the last few weeks. We assess 3 sizes of sea bass and 2 sizes of sea bream, both on an FOB East Coast basis. And these prices, like all the other U.S. wholesale categories, are reported on a weekly basis every Wednesday. And if you look at recent pricing for something like 600 to 800 gram sea bass, looking at week 35, which was the last week of August, was when wholesale prices began to rise. So it took a couple of weeks for the tariff to sort of work its way through the system from August 7th until the end of the month. If you look at prices from week 34 to now, that average price for a 600 to 800 gram sea bass has gone up from about $6.03 per pound to $6.50 per pound. That's an increase of about 8%, which again does suggest that some of this tariff is being swallowed on the other side of the Atlantic. But tariffs are not the only thing having an impact on bass and bream wholesale prices. As you can see, prices have been rising since before the tariffs were announced in April. The price increases earlier in the year were due in large part to supply issues. There have been severe heat mortality events in the Mediterranean each of the last 2 summers, which have killed off fish. With good demand on both the European and the American sides of the Atlantic, this has led to a real shortage and has driven prices up. Mediterranean sea temperatures in Turkey hit 30 degrees Celsius, which is about 86 degrees Fahrenheit this summer, which was really not welcome news for farmers who had just contended with the same situation last year. Larger fish are more susceptible to this type of heat mortality event, and there's been a real shortage of 800-gram and larger fish on the market. If you're looking to get a feel of what prices have done recently on the other side of the Atlantic without taking into account tariffs, we also have global pricing. And so, for instance, you could look at the Merca Madrid pricing for Greek origin sea bass and seabream, which have remained steady over recent weeks after a similar supply-driven run-up earlier in the year. Back to U.S. wholesale pricing, we're at a bit of a crossroads now. One bass and bream supplier has recently reduced prices, suggesting that the recent run-up has had a negative effect on demand, and that's even as the new generation of fish not affected by these heat mortality events are ready or close to ready for harvest. And another supplier, on the other hand, is weighing another price hike, and we will just have to see which way we go.